Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
This reaction was typical, because Jimmy was always the noisy one of the family. Under any form of stress, he believed in making his feelings known in the form of loud cries. When Dr. Allinson came to give him his routine inoculations, he heralded the appearance of the syringe with yells of, "Ow! This is going to hurt! Ow! Ow!" He had a kindred spirit in our good doctor, who bawled back at him, "Aye, that's right, it is! Ooh! Ah!" But Jimmy really did scare our dentist, because his propensity for noise appeared to carry on even under general anaesthesia. The long, quavering wail he emitted as he went under the gas brought the poor man out in a sweat of anxiety. Rosie solemnly opened the 3 gates on the way back. Then she looked up at me expectantly. I knew what it was. She wanted to play one of her games. She loved being quizzed just as Jimmy had loved to quiz me. I took my cue and began. "Give me the names of 6 blue flowers." She coloured quickly in satisfaction because, of course, she knew. "Field scabious, harebell, forget-me-not, bluebell, speedwell, meadow cranesbill." "Clever girl," I said. "Now let's see. How about the names of 6 birds?" Again the blush and the quick reply. "Magpie, curlew, thrush, plover, yellowhammer, rook." "Very good indeed. Now, name me 6 red flowers." And so it went on, day after day, with infinite variations. I only half realised at the time how lucky I was. I had a demanding round-the-clock job, and yet I had the company of my children at the same time. So many men work so hard to keep the home going that they lose touch with the families who are at the heart of it. But it never happened to me. Both Jimmy and Rosie, until they went to school, spent most of their time with me round the farms. With Rosie, as her school days approached, her attitude, always solicitous, became distinctly maternal. She really couldn't see how I was going to get by without her, and by the time she was 5, she was definitely worried. "Daddy," she would say seriously, "how are you going to manage when I'm at school? All those gates to open, and having to get everything out of the boot by yourself? It's going to be awful for you." I used to try to reassure her, patting her head as she looked up at me in the car. "I know, Rosie, I know. I'm going to miss you, but I'll get along somehow." Her response was always the same. A relieved smile, and then the comforting words, "But never mind, Daddy. I'll be with you every Saturday and Sunday. You'll be all right then." I suppose it was a natural result of my children seeing veterinary practice from early childhood and witnessing my own pleasure in my work, that they never thought of being anything else but veterinary surgeons. There was no problem with Jimmy. He was a tough little fellow and well able to stand the buffets of our job. But somehow I couldn't bear the idea of my daughter being kicked and trodden on and knocked down and covered with muck. Practice was so much rougher in those days. There were no metal crushes to hold the big struggling beasts. There were still quite a number of farm horses around, and they were the ones which regularly put the vets in hospital with broken legs and ribs. Rosie made it very clear that she wanted country practice, and to me this seemed very much a life for a man. In short, I talked her out of it. This really wasn't like me, because I have never been a heavy father, and have always believed that children should follow their inclinations. But as Rosie entered her teens, I dropped a long series of broad hints, and perhaps played unfairly by showing her as many grisly, dirty jobs as possible. She finally decided to be a doctor of humans. Now, when I see the high percentage of girls in the veterinary schools and observe the excellent work done by the 2 girl assistants in our own practice, I sometimes wonder if I did the right thing. But Rosie is a happy and successful doctor, and anyway, parents are never sure that they have done the right thing. They can only do what they think is right. However, all that was far in the future, as I drove home from Mr. Binns with my 3-year-old daughter by my side. She had started to sing again, and was just finishing the first verse of her great favourite, "Careless hands don't care when dreams slip through." Chapter 23. It was in 1950 that one of my heroes, George Bernard Shaw, broke his leg while pruning apple trees in his garden. By a coincidence, I had been reading some of the prefaces that same week, revelling in the unique wit of the man, and enjoying the feeling I always had with Shaw, that I was in contact with a mind whose horizons stretched far beyond those of the other literary figures of the day, and most other days. I was shocked when I read about the calamity, and there was no doubt the national press shared my feelings. Banner headlines pushed grave affairs of state off the front pages, and for weeks bulletins were published for the benefit of an anxious public. It was right that this should be, and I agreed with all the phrases which rolled off the journalists' typewriters. Literary genius, inspired musical critic who sailed fearlessly against the tide of public opinion, most revered playwright of our age. It was just about then that the Casling's calf broke its leg too, and I was called to set it. The Casling farm was one of a group of homesteads set high on the heathery Yorkshire moors. They were isolated places and often difficult to find. To reach some of them, you had to descend into gloomy, garlic-smelling gills and climb up the other side. With others, there was no proper road, just a clay path through the heather, and it came as a surprise to find farm buildings at the end of it. Casling's place didn't fall into either of these categories. It was perched on the moor top with a fine disregard for the elements. The only concession was a clump of hardy trees which had been planted to the west of the farm to give shelter from the prevailing wind, and the way those trees bent uniformly towards the stones of house and barns was testimony to the fact that the wind hardly ever stopped blowing. Mr. Casling and his two big sons slouched towards me as I got out of the car. The farmer was the sort of man you would expect to find in a place like this, his 60-year-old face purpled and roughened by the weather, wide bony shoulders pushing against the ragged material of his jacket. His sons, Alan and Harold, were in their 30s and resembled their father in almost every detail, even to the way they walked, hands deep in pockets, heads thrust forward, heavy boots trailing over the cobbles. Also, they didn't smile. They were good chaps, all of them, in fact a nice family, but they weren't smilers. "Now, Mr. Herriot." Mr. Casling peered at me under the frayed peak of his cap and came to the point without preamble. "Calf's in field." "Oh, right," I said. "Could you bring me a bucket of water, please, just about lukewarm?" At a nod from his father, Harold made wordlessly for the kitchen and returned within minutes with a much-dented receptacle. I tested the water with a finger. "Just right. That's fine." We set off through a gate with two stringy little sheepdogs slinking at our heels, and the wind met us with savage joy, swirling over the rolling bare miles of that high plateau, chill and threatening to the old and weak, fresh and sweet to the young and strong. About a score of calves were running with their mothers on a long rectangle of green cut from the surrounding heather. It was easy to pick out my patient, although, when the herd took off at the sight of us, it was surprising how fast he could run with his dangling hind leg. At a few barked commands from Mr. Casling, the dogs darted among the cattle, snapping at heels, baring their teeth at defiant horns, till they had singled out cow and calf. They stood guard then till the young men rushed in and bore the little animal to the ground. I felt the injured limb over with a tinge of regret. I was sure I could put him right, but I would have preferred a foreleg. Radius and ulna healed so beautifully, but in this case the crepitus was midway along the tibia, which was more tricky. However, I was thankful it was not the femur. That would have been a problem indeed. My patient was expertly immobilized, held flat on the sparse turf by Harold at the head, Alan at the tail, and their father in the middle. One of a country's vet's difficulties is that he often has to do vital work on a patient which won't keep still, but those three pairs of huge hands held the shaggy creature as in a vice. As I dipped my plaster bandages in the water and began to apply them to the fracture, I noticed that our heads were very close together. It was a very small calf, about a month old, and at times the three human faces were almost in contact, and yet nobody spoke. Veterinary work passes blithely by when there is good conversation, and it is a positive delight when you're lucky enough to have one of those dry Yorkshire raconteurs among your helpers. At times I have had to lay down my scalpel and laugh my fill before being able to continue. But here all was silence. The wind whistled, and once I heard the plaintive cry of a curlew, but the group around that prostrate animal might have been Trappist monks. I began to feel embarrassed. It wasn't a difficult job. I didn't need 100% concentration. With all my heart, I wished somebody would say something. Then, like a glorious flash of inspiration, I remembered the recent clamour in the newspapers. I could start things off at least. "Just like Bernard Shaw, eh?" I said with a light laugh. The silence remained impenetrable, and for about half a minute it seemed that I was going to receive no reply. Then Mr. Casling cleared his throat. "Who?" he inquired. "Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw, you know. He's broken his leg too." I was trying not to gabble. The silence descended again, and I had a strong feeling that I'd better leave it that way. I got on with my job, dousing the white cast with water and smoothing it over while the plaster worked its way under my fingernails. It was Harold who came in next. "Does he live about here?" No, not really." I decided to put on one more layer of bandage, wishing fervently that I'd never started this topic. I was tipping the bandage from the tin when Alan chipped in. "Darrowby fella, is he?" Things were becoming more difficult. "No," I replied airily. "I believe he spends most of his time in London." "London?" The conversation, such as it was, had been carried on without any movement of the heads, but now the three faces jerked up towards me with undisguised astonishment, and the three voices spoke as one. After the initial shock had worn off, the men looked down at the calf again, and I was hoping that the subject was dead, when Mr. Casling muttered from the corner of his mouth, "He won't be in farming line, then?" "Well, no. He writes plays." I didn't say anything about Shaw's intuitive recognition of Wagner as a great composer. I could see by the fitting side glances that I was in deep enough already. "We'll just give the plaster time to dry," I said. I sat back on the springy turf as the silence descended again. After a few minutes, I tapped a finger along the length of the white cast. It was as hard as stone. I got to my feet. "Right. You can let him go now." The calf bounded up and trotted away with his mother as though nothing had happened to him. With the support of the plaster, his lameness was vastly diminished, and I smiled. It was always a nice sight. "I'll take it off in a month," I said. But there was no further talk as we made our way over the field towards the gate. Still, I knew very well what the remarks would be over the farmhouse dinner table. "Queer lad, that veterinary. Kept on about some fella in London that writes plays." And my last feeling as I drove away was not just that all fame is relative, but that I would take care in future not to start talking about somebody who doesn't live about here. Chapter 24. November the 4th, 1961. The weather was, if anything, worse next morning, and I spent a night very like the one before. I noticed at mealtimes that the tablecloth was soaking wet. I kept quiet because I assumed that somebody had spilt something, but when it stayed wet all day, I had to mention it. The captain smiled at my query. "Ah, yes, Mr. Herriot. I should have told you. We have dipped it in water. It does not slide about the table so much." He looked at me ruefully. "When the cloth is wet, you can bet the weather is really bad." I saw his point. The sliding cloth, the slopping soup, and indeed the constant restlessness of everything on the table had been a problem for some time. I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that we had struck a rock every time the ship fell from the summit of the waves, and apparently it was a standing joke among the crew. Because after one of these shattering belly flops during lunch, the plates and cutlery flew all over the room, and Hanson the engineer jumped to his feet and peered out of the porthole. "Did you see that big stone?" he cried, staring at me with a terrified expression. It was a little jest for my benefit. Again, I had spent another disgracefully lazy day, stretched on my bunk, reading. I would have loved to do a few exercises on my hidden corner on deck, but I dared not take the chance. Even my trip for my daily shower was fraught with danger. It was a communal shower, and, so far as I knew, the only one on this tiny vessel. It was just a few yards away down the passage past the crew's quarters, but it seemed a long way as I reeled along armed with towel and soap. On my way, I could see several of the big flaxen-haired seamen lying on their bunks, and I am sure I did not imagine the hollow groans which issued from the doorways. Could it be that even these supermen were seasick? Tomorrow we will be in Stettin, and with a bit of luck I might get ashore and see something of interest. November the 5th, 1961. My wedding anniversary. Strange to be spending it in Poland. That morning when I awoke, the world was still, and the sea and sky were not wheeling beyond my cabin windows. I realized that we must be in Stettin, and heaved myself up in my bunk. I saw that we were moored to a frost-covered quay. It was very foggy, but I could see several men with rods fishing from the quayside. There was a Polish soldier on guard, but he was not festooned with artillery like the Russians. Also, he smiled when I called out to him. We were lying in a quiet backwater of the main river, the Oder, and there were willow trees and rushes at the water's edge. I judged from the wooden sheds with pens that this was probably a special place for the loading of livestock. The usual mob of officials descended on us. Representatives from customs, immigration, and farms. Among them was a handsome young Polish army officer who insisted not only on seeing the passports, but on interviewing each of their owners too. I tentatively approached the captain as he dealt with the throng in his cabin. "I'd like to go ashore into the town," I said. His expression was slightly harassed, and I couldn't help feeling that he would be glad to get rid of this pest from Yorkshire. He looked at me thoughtfully for a moment. "I am too busy to go with you, Mr. Herriot, and we must leave here at 11 a.m. "Well, that gives me 2 hours," I replied. My natural curiosity and my almost desperate desire for some exercise lent weight to my appeal. "All right," he raised a finger. "But you will not be late?" "No, I promise you." He nodded and returned to his business while I showed my pass to the soldier and set off for the town. Oh, it was lovely to be able to stride out in the frosty air, to feel my limbs moving after the days of immobility and Nielsen's insidious skills. The fog had lifted, and I could see about 2 miles away the roofs and spires of a sizable town. First, I passed a military barracks with gymnastic equipment outside it, then allotments with a few women digging in them. My immediate impression as I approached the town was of the tremendous devastation left from the RAF raids in wartime. Everywhere there were ruins and empty spaces. Vast buildings, some with ornate statuary over the doors, stood roofless with gaping windows. During the first mile of my walk, I saw hardly any evidence of efforts to repair these ravages. It was not until I reached the town centre that I came on modern blocks of flats with shops on their ground floors. I took great care to impress every turning on my mind. If I got lost, I couldn't ask my way back. Right inside the town, I was able to gain a general impression of the place and people. Obviously, they observed Sunday as a holiday because there was nobody working in the port area and most of the shops were closed. Notable exceptions were 2 hairdressers' salons side by side, designated Damski and Meski, above their respective doors. A lady was having a manicure in the front window of Damski. The population were arrayed in their Sunday best, and it seemed to me remarkable that the well-dressed man in Poland wore what amounted almost to a uniform. Black beret with a small stalk projecting from the top, dark gabardine mackintosh, and a navy blue suit. Also, every single one had a scarf crossed under his coat. The women were much smarter than in Clydida. There were little kiosks on every corner, and people were strolling up to buy their newspapers and cigarettes. These places also sold draft beer, and having been on an exclusive diet of bottled lager for some time, I watched with envy as one fellow downed a frothing pint. If I had possessed any Polish money, it would have been nice to emulate him. Stettin has 350,000 inhabitants, and I was struck by the greater air of comfort and civilization compared with Clydida. The people looked altogether smoother and more urbane, and the town had a cheerful atmosphere despite the ever-present ruins. Funny little single-decker tramcars ran through the streets, always in pairs, one joined to the other, and there were a lot of private cars and taxis. Shops displayed attractive dresses and materials, but a huge picture of Lenin reminded me that I was still behind the Iron Curtain. Groups of youths, well-dressed and laughing among themselves, were sauntering around, and I watched one family getting off a tram. Mum, very chic in a light fluffy hat and brightly coloured coat. Dad in the unvarying Blackberry and Mac, and two teenage sons in identically the same outfit. As I passed over the main river bridge, I could see innumerable barges moored along the banks. I walked past many churches, but saw only two elderly women going into them. I was amused when a little man in a soft hat, breeches and riding boots came and asked me the way somewhere in an unintelligible gibberish. He too, it seemed, was a stranger, but not, I warrant, as much a stranger as I. It was now a glorious, cold, sunny day, and I was revelling in the activity after my incarceration. But I kept referring to my son Jimmy's pocket watch, and when I saw I had been away an hour, I had to turn back. I reached the ship before 11 a.m. and found the Polish officials still in the captain's cabin. They had given the free booze and cigarettes a severe hammering and were exuding bonhomie when I came in. They seemed very glad to see me and shouted for me to sit down with them with merry cries of, "Doctor, please! Doctor, please!" I thought it was the schnapps which made them so welcoming, but later the captain said they had been anxious in case I got lost and kept asking him, "Has the Englishman returned yet?" But he said there was no doubt they had wrought havoc among the bottles, all except the young Polish officer, who had been very correct, and after one drink politely declined any more. I went down to the hold and had a look at the pigs. We were to have them for only 24 hours, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about them, but pigs are funny things. They often fight among themselves, and it occurred to me that if 800 of them started a free-for-all, it would be a problem. However, Polish pigs are perhaps more placid than ours, because I found them all lying asleep, snuggled up to each other in perfect harmony. During the day I heard an occasional squeal from the hold and dashed down there in some anxiety, but it always turned out to be an isolated squabble or flash of irritation, with none of the bleeding scars or torn ears I had seen so often in Yorkshire. On the whole, peace reigned. We had taken aboard a great load of potatoes to feed them till we reached Lübeck. The crew did not like carrying pigs because of the smell, and there was no doubt that the ship had an entirely different aroma now. This did not percolate as far as the cabins or mess room, but I am told that in the summer it is pretty bad, and shipboard life can be dominated by the ever-present atmosphere of pig. After lunch I spent a fascinating afternoon on the deck as the ship made its way through the delta of the Oder, which spread itself into a maze of huge lakes. This, I was told, was characteristic of the coastline in this region, right along through Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. If ever a pilot was needed, it was here. We sailed through the strangest and most desolate countryside I'd ever seen. Endless miles of flat marshlands with innumerable rush-lined inlets and pools, and occasional belts of trees. Clouds of wild duck and geese provided the only sign of life, and the effect was inexpressibly wild and lonely despite the bright sunshine. After about 4 hours, the delta narrowed to a straight channel, and we came to the port of Svinemund on the Baltic. This is a big naval base, and I saw a lot of Russian destroyers, torpedo boats and submarines. At the entrance to the port, we dropped the pilot and headed out to sea again. The gale had dropped, and the weather was now much better. It was very pleasant to stand out there in the stern, watching the land recede as the ship glided through calm water with hardly any rolling. As far as my eye could reach, the coastline was thickly wooded, mainly with pine trees right down to the water's edge. There were some sandy beaches and cliffs, but no hills. I stayed outside as we cruised along the East German coast, never out of sight of land, and maybe it was because my voyage was nearly over that I didn't want to go below. I came inside only when the daylight was drowned in a magnificent sunset. The ship's officers were particularly charming since it was my wedding anniversary. They shook my hand warmly and bombarded me with lager. The captain asked anxiously if he should send a telegram to my wife, but I explained that I had left a card with Rosie and I felt that a telegram might alarm Helen. The cook, too, produced what I think must have been a banquet in my honour, because it had a touch of England about it. A delectable soup of celery, spinach and other vegetables, then roast pork with crackling, accompanied by roast ham, potatoes, and red cabbage. Dessert was sago pudding thickly sprinkled with cinnamon. After dinner we had our usual and sadly my last session with the schnapps. The captain, red-eyed and tired after 1.5 hours sleep in the last 24, still managed to be the perfect host. November the 6th, 1961. The end of it all. From Lübeck to Hamburg by train, then by plane to Heathrow, London, before the last lap to Derby. I had much to think of on the way. I had been lucky enough to have a peep at mysterious places, a glimpse of a totally different world. But when I look back on the last 10 days, my warmest and most vivid memories were of the ship, the animals, and the people aboard her. The brave little Iris Clausen, butting her way through the storms and with the sheep safe inside her, the big, tough, yellow-haired crewmen, especially Raun and Jumbo, and of course the ship's officers who had treated me so kindly. The captain who never seemed to lose his grace. Carl Rasmussen, the mate, tubby, balding, and with the mighty appetite. Peter Hansen, the engineer, always ready with a joke. And of course, my devoted Nielsen, who I feel sure put half a stone of surplus flesh onto me. I hoped they had the same friendly memories of me. The captain, invariably courteous as he was, must have regarded me as an unmitigated nuisance at times. But Nielsen, I knew, was going to miss me. Chapter 25. Was there no peace in a vet's life? I wondered fretfully as I hurried my car along the road to Gilthorpe village. 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening, and here I was trailing off to visit a dog 10 miles away, which, according to Helen, who had taken the message, had been ailing for more than a week. I had worked all morning, then spent an afternoon in the hills with the children and some of their friends, a long-standing weekly event during which we had managed to explore nearly every corner of the district over the years. Jimmy had set a brisk pace with his hardy young pals, and I'd had to carry Rosie on my shoulders up the steepest slopes. After tea, there was the usual routine of baths, story reading, and bed for the two of them. Then I was ready to settle down with the Sunday papers and listen to the radio. Yet here I was, back on the treadmill, staring through the windscreen at the roads and the walls which I saw day in, day out. When I left Derby, the streets of the little town were empty in the gathering dusk, and the houses had that tight-shut, comfortable look, which raised images of armchairs and pipes and firesides. And now, as I saw the lights of the farms winking on the fell-sides, I could picture the stocksmen dozing contentedly with their feet up. I had not passed a single car on the darkening road. There was nobody out but Herriot. I was really sloshing around in my trough of self-pity when I drew up outside a row of greystone cottages at the far end of Gilthorpe. Mrs. Cundall, number 4, Chestnut Row, Helen had written on the slip of paper, and as I opened the gate and stepped through the tiny strip of garden, my mind was busy with half-formed ideas of what I was going to say. My few years' experience in practice had taught me that it did no good at all to remonstrate with people for calling me out at unreasonable times. I knew perfectly well that my words never seemed to get through to them, and that they would continue to do exactly as they had done before. But for all that, I had to say something, if only to make me feel better. No need to be rude or ill-mannered, just a firm statement of the position. That vets like to relax on Sunday evenings just like other people. That we did not mind at all coming out for emergencies, but that we did object to having to visit animals which had been ill for a week. I had my speech fairly well prepared when a little middle-aged woman opened the door. "Good evening, Mrs. Cundall," I said, slightly tight-lipped. "Oh, it's Mr. Herriot." She smiled shyly. "We've never met, but I've seen you walking around Derby on market days. Come inside." The door opened straight into the little low-beamed living room, and my first glance took in the shabby furniture and some pictures framed in tarnished gilt, when I noticed that the end of the room was partly curtained off. Mrs. Cundall pulled the curtain aside. In a narrow bed a man was lying, a skeleton thin man whose eyes looked up at me from hollows in a yellowed face. "This is my husband, Ron," she said cheerfully, and the man smiled and raised a bony arm from the quilt in greeting. "And here is your patient, Herman," she went on, pointing to a little dachshund who sat by the side of the bed. "Herman?" "Yes. We thought it was a good name for a German sausage dog." They both laughed. "Of course," I said. "Excellent name. He looks like a Herman." The little animal gazed up at me, bright-eyed and welcoming. I bent down and stroked his head, and the pink tongue flicked over my fingers. I ran my hand over the glossy skin. "He looks very healthy. What's the trouble?" "Oh, he's fine in himself," Mrs. Cundall replied. "Eats well and everything, but over the last week he's been going funny on his legs. We weren't all that worried, but tonight he sort of flopped down and couldn't get up again." "I see." I noticed he didn't seem keen to rise when I patted his head. I put my hand under the little dog's body and gently lifted him onto his feet. "Come on, lad," I said. "Come on, Herman, let's see you walk." As I encouraged him, he took a few hesitant steps, but his hind end swayed progressively, and he soon dropped into the sitting position again. "It's his back, isn't it?" Mrs. Cundall said. "He's strong enough in his forelegs." "That's my trouble too," Ron murmured in a soft, husky voice. But he was smiling, and his wife laughed and patted the arm on the quilt. I lifted the dog onto my knee. "Yes, the weakness is certainly in the back." I began to palpate the lumbar vertebrae, feeling my way along, watching for any sign of pain. "Has he hurt himself?" Mrs. Cundall asked. "Has somebody hit him? We don't usually let him out alone, but sometimes he sneaks out through the garden gate." "There's always the possibility of an injury," I said. "But there are other causes." There were indeed. A host of unpleasant possibilities. I didn't like the look of this little dog at all. This syndrome was one of the things I hated to encounter in canine practice. "Can you tell me what you really think?" she said. "I'd like to know." "Well, an injury could cause hemorrhage or concussion or edema. That's fluid, all affecting his spinal cord. He could even have a fractured vertebra, but I don't think so." "And how about the other causes?" "Well, there's quite a lot. Tumours, bony growths, abscesses, or discs can press on the cord." "Discs?" "Yes, little pads of cartilage and fibrous tissue between the vertebrae. In long-bodied dogs like Herman, they sometimes protrude into the spinal canal. In fact, I think that is what's causing his symptoms." Ron's husky voice came again from the bed. "And what's his prospects, Mr. Herriot?" No, that was the question. Complete recovery or incurable paralysis? It could be anything. "Very difficult to say at this moment," I said. "I'll give him an injection and some tablets, and we'll see how he goes over the next few days." I injected an analgesic and some antibiotic, and counted out some salicylate tablets into a box. We had no steroids at that time. It was the best I could do. "Now then, Mr. Herriot," Mrs. Cundall smiled at me eagerly. "Ron has a bottle of beer every night about this time. Would you like to join him?" "Well, it's very kind of you, but I don't want to intrude." "Oh, you're not doing that? We're glad to see you." She poured 2 glasses of brown ale, propped her husband up with pillows, and sat down by the bed. "We're from South Yorkshire, Mr. Herriot," she said. I nodded. I had noticed the difference from the local accent. "Aye. We come up here after Ron's accident 8 years ago." "What was that?" "I were a miner," Ron said. "Roof fell in on me. I got a broken back, crushed liver, and a lot of other internal injuries, but 2 of me mates were killed in the same fall, so I'm lucky to be here." He sipped his beer. "I've survived, but doctor says I'll never walk no more." "I'm terribly sorry." "Nay, nay," the husky voice went on. "I count me blessings, and I've got a lot to be thankful for. I suffer very little, and I've got best wife in the world." Mrs. Cundall laughed. "Oh, listen to him. But I'm right glad we came to Gilthorpe. We used to spend all our holidays in the Dales. We were great walkers, and it was lovely to get away from the smoke and the chimneys. The bedroom in our old house just looked out on a lot of brick walls. But Ron has this big window right by him, and he can see for miles." "Yes, of course," I said. "This is a lovely situation." The village was perched on a high ridge on the fell side, and that window would command a wide view of the green slopes running down to the river, and climbing high to the wildness of the moor on the other side. This sight had beguiled me so often on my rounds, and the grassy paths climbing among the airy tops seemed to beckon to me, but they would beckon in vain to Ron Cundall. "Getting Herman was a good idea too," he said. I used to feel a bit lonely when Mrs. went into Darrowby for shopping, but the little fella's made all the difference. You're never alone when you've got a dog." I smiled. "How right you are. What's his age now, by the way?" "He's 6, Ron replied. "Right in the prime of life, aren't you, old lad?" He let his arm fall by the bedside and his hand fondled the sleek ears. "That seems to be his favourite place." "Ah, it's a funny thing, but he allus sits there. Mrs. is the one who has to take him walks and feed him, but he's very faithful to me. He has a basket over there, but this is his place. I only have to reach down and he's there." This was something that I had seen on many occasions with disabled people, that their pets stayed close by them, as if conscious of their role of comforter and friend. I finished my beer and got to my feet. Ron looked up at me. "Reckon I'll spin mine out a bit longer." He glanced at his half-full glass. "I used to shift about 6 pints some nights when I was out with lads, but you know, I enjoy this one bottle just as much. Strange how things turn out." His wife bent over him, mock scolding. "Yes, you've had to right your ways. You're a reformed character, aren't you?" They both laughed as though it were a stock joke between them. "Well, thank you for the drink, Mrs. Candle. I'll look in to see Herman on Tuesday." I moved towards the door. As I left, I waved to the man in the bed and his wife put her hand on my arm. "We're very grateful to you for coming out at this time on a Sunday night, Mr. Herriot. We felt awful about calling you, but you understand it was only today that the little chap started going off his legs like that." "Oh, of course, of course. Please don't worry." I didn't mind in the least. And as I drove through the darkness, I knew that I didn't mind. Now. My petty irritation had evaporated within 2 minutes of my entering that house, and I was left only with a feeling of humility. If that man back there had a lot to be thankful for, how about me? I had everything. I only wished I could dispel the foreboding I felt about his dog. There was a hint of doom about those symptoms of Herman's, and yet I knew I just had to get him right. On Tuesday he looked much the same, possibly a little worse. "I think I'd better take him back to the surgery for X-ray," I said to Mrs. Candle. "He doesn't seem to be improving with the treatment." In the car, Herman curled up happily on Rosie's knee, submitting with good grace to a petting. I had no need to anaesthetize him or sedate him when I placed him on our newly acquired X-ray machine. Those hindquarters stayed still all by themselves. A lot too still for my liking. I was no expert at interpreting X-ray pictures, but at least I could be sure there was no fracture of the vertebrae. Also, there was no sign of bony extoses. But I thought I could detect a narrowing of the space between a couple of the vertebrae, which would confirm my suspicions of a protrusion of a disc. Laminectomy or fenestration had not yet been heard of in those days, so I could do nothing more than continue with my treatment and hope. By the end of the week, hope had grown very dim. I had supplemented the salicylates with long-standing remedies like tincture of nux vomica and other ancient stimulant drugs, but when I saw Herman on the Saturday, he was unable to rise. I tweaked the toes of his hind limbs and was rewarded by a faint reflex movement, but with a sick certainty I knew the complete posterior paralysis was not far away. A week later, I had the unhappy experience of seeing my prognosis confirmed in the most classical way. When I entered the door of the Candles' cottage, Herman came to meet me, happy and welcoming in his front end, but dragging his hind legs helplessly behind him. "Hello, Mr. Herriot." Mrs. Candle gave me a wan smile and looked down at the little creature stretched frog-like on the carpet. "What do you think of him now?" I bent and tried the reflexes. Nothing. I shrugged my shoulders, unable to think of anything to say. I looked at the gaunt figure in the bed, the arm outstretched as always on the quilt. "Good morning, Ron," I said as cheerfully as I could. But there was no reply. The face was averted, looking out of the window. I walked over to the bed. Ron's eyes were staring fixedly at the glorious panorama of moor and fell, at the pebbles of the river, white in the early sunshine, at the criss-cross of the grey walls against the green. His face was expressionless. It was as though he did not know I was there. I went back to his wife. I don't think I have ever felt more miserable. "Is he annoyed with me?" I whispered. "No, no, no. It's this." She held out a newspaper. "It's upset him something awful." I looked at the printed page. There was a large picture at the top, a picture of a dachshund exactly like Herman. This dog, too, was paralysed, but its hind end was supported by a little four-wheeled bogey. On the picture it appeared to be sporting with its mistress. In fact, it looked quite happy and normal, except for those wheels. Ron seemed to hear the rustle of the paper because his head came round quickly. "What do you think of that, Mr. Herriot? Do you agree with it?" "Well, I don't really know, Ron. I don't like the look of it, but I suppose the lady in the picture thought it was the only thing to do." "Aye, maybe." The husky voice trembled. "But I don't want Herman to finish up like that." The arm dropped by the side of the bed and his fingers felt around on the carpet, but the little dog was still splayed out near the door. "It's hopeless now, Mr. Herriot, isn't it?" "Well, it was a black lookout from the beginning," I said. "These cases are so difficult. I'm very sorry." "Nay, I'm not blaming you," he said. "You've done what you could. Same as vet for that dog in the picture did what he could. But it was no good, was it? What do we do now? Put him down?" "No, Ron, forget about that just now. Sometimes paralysis cases just recover on their own after many weeks. But we must carry on. At this moment, I honestly cannot say there is no hope." I paused for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Cundall. "One of the problems is the dog's natural functions. You'll have to carry him out into the garden for that. If you gently squeeze each side of his abdomen, you'll encourage him to pass water. I'm sure you'll soon learn how to do that." "Oh, of course," she replied. "I'll do anything, as long as there's some hope." "There is. I assure you there is." But on the way back to the surgery, the thought hammered in my brain. That hope was very slight. Spontaneous recovery did sometimes occur, but Herman's condition was extreme. I repressed a groan as I thought of the nightmarish atmosphere which had begun to surround my dealings with the Cundalls. The paralysed man and the paralysed dog. And why did that picture have to appear in the paper just at this very time? Every veterinary surgeon knows the feeling that fate has loaded the scales against him, and it weighed on me, despite the bright sunshine spreading into the car. However, I kept going back every few days. Sometimes I took a couple of bottles of brown ale along in the evening and drank them with Ron. He and his wife were always cheerful, but the little dog never showed the slightest sign of improvement. He still had to pull his useless hind limbs after him when he came to greet me, and though he always returned to his station by his master's bed, nuzzling up into Ron's hand, I was beginning to resign myself to the certainty that one day that arm would come down from the quilt, and Herman would not be there. It was on one of these visits that I noticed an unpleasant smell as I entered the house. There was something familiar about it. I sniffed, and the Cundalls looked at each other guiltily. There was a silence, and then Ron spoke. "It's some medicine I've been giving Herman. Stinks like hell, but it's supposed to be good for dogs." "Oh, yes?" "Aye, well..." His fingers twitched uncomfortably on the bedclothes. "It was Bill Noakes put me onto it. He's an old mate of mine. We used to work down pit together, and he came to visit me last weekend. He keeps a few whippets, does Bill. Knows a lot about dogs, and he sent me this stuff along for Herman." Mrs. Cundall went to the cupboard and sheepishly presented me with a plain bottle. I removed the cork, and as the horrid stench rose up to me, my memory became suddenly clear. Asafoetida, a common constituent of quack medicines before the war, and still lingering on the shelves of occasional chemist shops, and in the medicine chests of people who like to doctor their own animals. I had never prescribed the stuff myself, but it was supposed to be beneficial in horses with colic and dogs with digestive troubles. My own feeling had always been that its popularity had been due solely to the assumption that anything which stunk as badly as that must have some magical properties. But one thing I knew for sure was that it could not possibly do anything for Herman. I replaced the cork. "So, you're giving him this, eh?" Ron nodded. Aye, 3 times a day. He doesn't like it much, but Bill Noakes has great faith in it. Cured hundreds of dogs with it, he says. The deep-sunk eyes looked at me with a silent appeal. Well, fine, Ron, I said. You carry on. Let's hope it does the trick. I knew the asafoetida couldn't do any harm, and since my treatment had proved useless, I was in no position to turn haughty. But my main concern was that these 2 nice people had been given a glimmer of hope, and I wasn't going to blot it out. Mrs. Cundall smiled, and Ron's expression relaxed. Oh, that's grand, Mr. Herriot, he said. I'm glad you don't mind. I can dose the little fella myself. It's summer for me to do. It was about a week after the commencement of the new treatment that I called in at the Cundalls as I was passing through Gilthorpe. How are you today, Ron? I asked. Champion, Mr. Herriot. Champion. He always said that, but today there was a new eagerness in his face. He reached down and lifted his dog onto the bed. Look here. He pinched the little paw between his fingers, and there was a faint but definite retraction of the leg. I almost fell over in my haste to grab at the other foot. The result was the same. My God, Ron, I gasped. The reflexes are coming back. He laughed, his soft, husky laugh. Bill knows stuff. It's working, isn't it? A gush of emotions, mainly professional shame and wounded pride, welled in me, but it was only for a moment. Yes, Ron, I replied. It's working. No doubt about it. He stared up at me. Then Herman's going to be all right. Well, it's early days yet, but that's the way it looks to me. It was several weeks more before the little dachshund was back to normal. And, of course, it was a fairly typical case of spontaneous recovery, with nothing whatever to do with the asafoetida, or indeed with my own efforts. Even now, 30 years later, when I treat these puzzling back conditions with steroids, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and sometimes colloidal calcium, I wonder how many of them would have recovered without my aid. Quite a number, I imagine. Sadly, despite the modern drugs, we still have our failures. And I always regard a successful termination with profound relief. But that feeling of relief has never been stronger than it was with Herman, and I can recall vividly my final call at the cottage in Gilthorpe. As it happened, it was around the same time as my first visit, 8 o'clock in the evening, and when Mrs. Cundall ushered me in, the little dog bounded joyously up to me before returning to his post by the bed. Well, that's a lovely sight, I said. He can gallop like a racehorse now. Ron dropped his hand down and stroked the sleek head. Ah, isn't it grand? By heck, it's been a worrying time. Well, I'll be going. I gave Herman a farewell pat. I just looked in on my way home to make sure all was well. I don't need to come any more now. Nay, nay, Ron said, don't rush off. You've time to have a bottle of beer with me before you go. I sat down by the bed and Mrs. Cundall gave us our glasses before pulling up a chair for herself. It was exactly like that first night. I poured my beer and looked at the 2 of them. Their faces glowed with friendliness, and I marvelled because my part in Herman's salvation had been anything but heroic. In their eyes, everything I had done must have seemed bumbling and ineffectual. And in fact, they must be convinced that all would have been lost if Ron's old chum from the coalface had not stepped in and effortlessly put things right. At best, they could only regard me as an amiable fathead, and all the explanations and protestations in the world would not alter that. But, though my ego had been bruised, I didn't really care. I was witnessing a happy ending instead of a tragedy, and that was more important than petty self-justification. I made a mental resolve never to say anything which might spoil their picture of this triumph. I was about to take my first sip when Mrs. Cundall spoke up. This is your last visit, Mr. Herriot, and all's ended well. I think we ought to drink some sort of toast. I agree, I said. "Let's see, what shall it be?" "Ah, yes, I've got it." I raised my glass. "Here's to Bill Noakes." Chapter 26. The Bull with the Bowler Hat. That was one of the irreverent terms for artificial insemination when it first arrived on the post-war scene. Of course, AI was a wonderful advance. Up till the official licensing of bulls, the farmers had used any available male bovine to get their cows in calf. A cow had to produce a calf before it would give milk, and it was milk that was the goal of the dairy farmers. But unfortunately, the progeny of these scrub bulls were often low-grade and weakly. But AI was a great improvement on licensing. To use a high-class pedigree-proven bull to inseminate large numbers of cows for farmers who could never afford to own such an animal was and is a splendid idea. Over the years, I have seen countless thousands of superior young heifers, bullocks and bulls populate the farms of Britain, and I have rejoiced. I'm speaking theoretically, however. My own practical experience of artificial insemination was brief and unhappy. When the thing first began, most practitioners thought they would be rushing about doing a lot of insemination on their own account, and Siegfried and I could hardly wait to get started. We purchased an artificial vagina, which was a tube of hard, vulcanized rubber about 18 inches long with a lining of latex. There was a little tap on the tube, and warm water was run into this to simulate the temperature of a genuine bovine vagina. On one end of the AV was a latex cone secured by rubber bands, and this cone terminated in a glass tube in which the semen was collected. Apart from its use in insemination, this instrument provided an excellent means of testing the farmer's own bulls for fertility. It was in this context that I had my first experience. Wally Hartley had bought a young Ayrshire bull from one of the big dairy farmers, and he wanted the animal's fertility tested by the new method. He rang me to ask if I would do the job, and I was elated at the chance to try out our new acquisition. At the farm, I filled the liner with water just nicely at blood heat and fastened on the cone and glass tube. I was ready and eager for action. The required cow in estrus was in a large loose box off the yard, and the farmer led the bull towards it. "He's nobbut a little un," Mr. Hartley said, "but I wouldn't trust him. He's a cheeky young beggar. Never served a cow yet, but keen as mustard." I eyed the bull. Certainly he wasn't large, but he had mean eyes and the sharp, curving horns of the typical Ayrshire. Anyway, this job shouldn't be much trouble. I had never seen it done, but had flipped through a pamphlet on the subject, and it seemed simple enough. All you did was to wait till the bull started to mount. Then you directed the protruded penis into the AV. Apparently then, the bull, with surprising gullibility, thrust happily into the water-filled cylinder and ejaculated into the tube. I had been told repeatedly that there was nothing to it. I went into the box. "Let him in, Wally," I said, and the farmer opened the half door. The bull trotted inside, and the cow, fastened by a halter to a ring on the wall, submitted calmly as he sniffed around her. He seemed to like what he saw, because he finally stationed himself behind her with eager anticipation. This was the moment. "Take up position on the right side of the bull," the pamphlet had said, "and the rest will be easy." With surprising speed, the young animal threw his forelegs on the cow's rump and surged forward. I had to move quickly, and as the penis emerged from the sheath, I grabbed it and poised the AV for action. But I didn't get the chance. The bull dismounted immediately and swung round on me with an affronted glare. He looked at me carefully up and down as though he didn't quite believe what he saw, and there was not an ounce of friendliness in his expression. Then he appeared to remember the rather pressing business on hand and turned his attention to the cow again. He leapt up, I grabbed, and once more he suspended his activities abruptly and brought his forefeet thudding to the ground. This time there was more than outraged dignity in his eyes. There was anger. He snorted, shook the needle-sharp horns in my direction, and dragged a little straw along the floor with a hoof, before fixing me with a long, appraising stare. He didn't have to speak. His message was unequivocal. "Just try that once more, chum, and you've had it." As his eyes lingered on me, everything seemed to become silent and motionless, as though I were part of a picture. the cow standing patiently, the churned straw beneath the animals, and beyond them the farmer out in the yard, leaning over the half-door waiting for the next move. I wasn't particularly looking forward to that next move. I felt a little breathless, and my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth. At length the bull, with a final warning glance at me, decided to resume his business and reared up on the cow once more. I gulped, bent quickly, and as his slim red organs shot forth, I grabbed it and tried to bring the AV down on it. This time the bull didn't mess about. He sprang away from the cow, put his head down, and came at me like a bullet. In that fleeting instant I realized what a fool I had been to stand with the animals between me and the door. Behind me was the dark corner of the box. I was trapped. Fortunately, the AV was dangling from my right hand, and as the bull charged, I was able to catch him an upward blow on the snout. If I'd hit him on the top of the head, he would never have felt it, and one or both of those nasty horns would inevitably have started to explore my interior. But as it was, the hard rubber cylinder thumping against his nose brought him to a slithering halt, and while he was blinking and making up his mind about having a second go, I rained blows on him with a frenzy born of terror. I have often wondered since that day if I am the only veterinary surgeon to have used an artificial vagina as a defensive weapon. It certainly was not built for the purpose, because it soon began to disintegrate under my onslaught. First, the glass tube hurtled past the ear of the startled farmer who was watching wide-eyed from the doorway. Then the cone spun away against the flank of the cow, who had started to chew her cud placidly, oblivious of the drama being enacted by her side. I alternated my swipes with thrusts and lunges, worthy of a fencing master, but I still couldn't jockey my way out of that corner. However, although my puny cylinder couldn't hurt the bull, I obviously had him puzzled. Apart from a lot of weaving and prodding with his horns, he made no sign of repeating his first headlong charge and seemed content to keep me penned in the few feet of space. But I knew it was only a matter of time. He was out to get me, and I was wondering how it felt to receive a Canada when he took a step back and came in again, full tilt, head down. I met him with a backhanded slash, and that was what saved me, because the elastic holding the latex lining came off and the warm water from within fountained into the bull's eyes. He stopped suddenly, and it was then, I think, he just decided to give up. In his experience of humans, I was something new to him. I had taken intimate liberties with him in the pursuit of his lawful duty. I had belaboured him with a rubber instrument, and finally squirted water in his face. He had plainly had enough of me. During his pause for thought, I dodged past him, threw open the door, and escaped into the yard. The farmer looked at me as I fought for breath. "By go, Mr. Herriot, it's a hell of a job, this AI, isn't it?" "Yes, Wally," I replied shakily. "It is, rather." "Is it honest like that?" "No, Wally. No." I looked sadly at my bedraggled AV. "This is an exceptional case. I think we'd better get a specialist in to collect a sample from this bull." The farmer rubbed his ear where the tube had clipped it in passing. "All right then, Mr. Herriot. You'll let me know when you're coming, I suppose. It'll be another bit of excitement to look forward to." His words did nothing to ease the feeling of abject failure as I crept away from the farm. Vets were taking semen samples every day now with no trouble at all. What was the matter with me? Back in the surgery, I phoned the advisory service. Yes, they said. They would send us out one of their sterility advisory officers. He would meet me on the farm at 10 o'clock the next morning. When I arrived there on the following day, the officer was already in the yard, and I thought there was something familiar about the back of the jaunty figure, strolling over the cobbles and blowing out clouds of cigarette smoke. When he turned round, I saw with a gush of relief that it was Tristan. I hadn't been looking forward to recounting my shameful performance to a stranger. His broad grin was like a tonic. "Hello, Jim. How are things?" "Fine," I replied, "except for this semen collection. I know you're doing it all the time, but I had a shambolic experience yesterday." "Really?" He pulled deeply at his woodbine. "Tell me about it." "Mr. Hartley's just on his way in from the fields." We stepped inside the loose box, the scene of the previous day's debacle, and I began my tale. I hadn't got far before Tristan's jaw dropped. "You mean you just let the bull in here on his own without any restraint?" "That's right." "You daft bugger, Jim. You're lucky to be here. In the first place, this job should always be done in the open. And secondly, the bull should always be held by a pole or halter through the ring nose. I like to have 2 or 3 blokes helping me. He shot me an incredulous glance as he lit another woodbine. Anyway, go on. As I proceeded with my story, his expression began to change. His mouth twitched, his chin trembled, and little giggles burst from him. Are you trying to tell me that you grabbed him by his old man? Well, yes. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Tristan leant back against the wall and laughed immoderately for a long time. When he had recovered, he regarded me pityingly. Jim, old lad, you are supposed to put your hand only on the sheath to do the directing. I gave a wry smile. Oh, I know that now. I had another read at the pamphlet last night, and I realized I had made a lot of mistakes. Well, never mind, he said. Carry on with your story. You're beginning to interest me. The next few minutes had a devastating effect on my colleague. As I described the bull's attack on me, he slumped, shouting, against the door, and by the time I had finished, he was hanging limply with his arms dangling over the woodwork. Tears coursed down his cheeks, and feeble little moans issued from his mouth. You were in that corner, fighting the bull off with the AV, clatting over the nut with all that stuff flying around? He reached for his handkerchief. For God's sake, don't tell me any more, Jim. You'll do me an injury. He wiped his eyes and straightened up, but I could see that the whole thing had taken it out of him. He turned unsteadily as he heard the farmer's footsteps in the yard. Oh, good morning, Mr. Hartley, he said. We can get started now. Tristan was very businesslike as he directed operations. Yesterday's cow was still in estrus, and within minutes she was tied to a gatepost in the yard with a man on either side. That's to stop her swinging round when the bull mounts, he explained to me. He turned to the farmer and handed him the AV. Will you fill this with warm water, please, and screw the stopper on tightly? The farmer trotted into the house, and as he returned, another of his men led out the bull. This time, my antagonist of yesterday was securely held by a halter through his ring. Tristan had certainly got everything arranged in an orderly fashion. The farmer had said that the bull was as keen as mustard, and his words were verified when the young animal took one look at the cow and started towards her, a picture of urgent lust. Tristan scarcely had time to get the AV into his hand before the bull was clambering eagerly aboard his quarry. I had to admit my young colleague was lightning fast as he stooped, seized the sheath, and sent the penis plunging into the AV. So that was how it was done, I thought wistfully. So very easy. My feeling of shame was building up, when the bull pushed out his tongue and emitted a long, drawn-out, deafening bellow of rage. And he had scarcely entered the AV when he withdrew with a backward leap and began to caper round on the end of his halter, filling the air with disapproving bawls. What the hell? Tristan stared at the animal in bewilderment. Then he poked his finger into the AV. Good God! He cried. The water in here is damned hot! Wally Hartley nodded. Aye, well, the kettle had just come to boil when I went into the house, so I just poured it straight in. Tristan clutched his brow and groaned. Oh, bugger it, he muttered to me. I always check the temperature with a thermometer, but what with talking to you and that young beggar going into action so fast, I clean forgot. Boiling water? No wonder the poor sod got out quick. Meanwhile, the bull had stopped his noise and was circling the cow, sniffing her over and regarding her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. What a woman! Was clearly the dominant thought in his mind. Anyway, let's have another try. Tristan made for the farmhouse. I'll fill the thing myself this time. Soon the stage was set once more. Tristan standing at the ready, and the bull, apparently undeterred by his recent experience, patently eager to join battle again. It is difficult to know what an animal is thinking, and at that moment I wondered whether the bull was in a torment of frustration, remembering the disasters of yesterday and the recent blow to his pride and comfort. By his attitude now, he looked as though, come hell or high water, he was going to serve that cow. My impression was confirmed when he made a sudden rush at her. Tristan, slightly pop-eyed, managed to jam the AV over the penis as it hurtled past him. But as he did so, the velocity of the charge caused the animal to lose his footing, so that the bull slid on his back clean underneath the cow. The AV was jerked from Tristan's grasp and soared high into the air. Mr. Hartley followed it, open-mouthed, as it described a graceful parabola before landing on a pile of straw at the other end of the yard. As the bull scrambled to his feet, Tristan strolled unhurriedly towards the straw. The glass tube was still attached to the cylinder, and my friend held it up at eye level. "Oh, yes," he murmured. "A nice 3cc sample." The farmer came puffing up. "You've got what you wanted, have you?" "Yes, indeed," Tristan replied airily. "Exactly what I wanted." The farmer shook his head wonderingly. "By hell, it's a complicated sort of business, isn't it?" "Ah, well," Tristan shrugged his shoulders. "It can be just a little at times, it can be. Anyway, I'll get my microscope from the car and examine the sample." It didn't take long, and soon afterwards we were all having a cup of tea in the kitchen. My colleague put down his cup and reached for a scone. "That's a fine, fertile bull you have there, Mr. Hartley." That's champion." The farmer rubbed his hands. "I paid a fair bit of brass for him, and it's grand to know he's up to scratch." He looked across at the young man with undisguised admiration. "You've done a grand job, and I'm right grateful to you." As I sipped my tea, the thought occurred to me that despite the passage of years, things hadn't changed. Just as that glass tube had landed on a soft bed of straw, Tristan always landed on his feet. Chapter 27. I winced as Jack Scott's slender frame crashed against the cow's ribs, but Jack himself didn't seem unduly troubled. His eyes popped a little and his cap slid over one ear, but he took a fresh grip on the tail, braced his boots once more against the cobbles, and prepared himself for further action. I was trying to irrigate the cow's uterus with Lugol's iodine. This was the common post-war treatment for infertility in cattle caused by endometritis, but it involved the insertion of a long metal Nielsen catheter through the uterine cervix, and this animal didn't seem to appreciate it. Every time I attempted to work the catheter through the cervical folds, she swung round violently, and since the farmer weighed only about 8 stones, he was whirled repeatedly against the neighbouring cow. But this time, I had the feeling I was winning. The tube was sliding nicely into the uterus, and if only she would stand still for a few seconds, the job would be over. "Hang on, Jack," I gasped as I began to pump in the Lugols. As soon as the cow felt the fluid trickling in, she veered over again, and the farmer's mouth fell open as he was squashed between the big creatures. And when a hoof descended on his toes, a soft groan escaped him. "Lovely, that's it." I withdrew the catheter and stepped back, thinking at the same time that this had been a singularly uncooperative patient. Jack, however, didn't seem to share my view. Hobbling on his bruised foot, he went up to the front of the cow and put his arms round her neck. "Ah, you're a grand old lass," he murmured, resting his cheek against the craggy jaw. I looked at him wonderingly. It was always like this with Jack. He had a deep affection for every creature, human and animal, on his farm, and, with an occasional exception such as the cow I had just treated, the feelings seemed to be returned. When he had concluded his embrace, he pushed his way out and hopped over the dung channel. His face wore its usual smile. It was not the ruddy face of the typical farmer. In fact, it was always pale and haggard, as though its owner hadn't slept for a few nights, and the deep wrinkles on the cheeks and forehead made Jack look older than his 40 years. But the smile was radiant, like an inner light. "I've 1 or 2 other jobs for you, Mr. Herriot," he said. "First, I want you to give a bullock a shot. He's got a bit of a cough." We walked across the yard with Jack's sheepdog, Rip, gambolling around his master in delight. Often these farm dogs were slinking, furtive little creatures, but Rip behaved like a happy pet. The farmer bent and patted him. "Hello, fella. Are you coming too?" As the dog went into further transports, a little boy and girl, the 2 youngest of the Scott family, trotted along with us. "Dad, where you going?" "Dad, what you doing?" they cried. There were usually children mixed up with the visits on this farm, getting in between the cow's legs, often hindering the work, but it never worried Jack. The bullock was lying in deep straw in a loose box. He was a huge animal, and obviously not very ill, because he was placidly chewing his cud as we entered. "There's not much wrong with him," Jack said. "Maybe just a bit of cold. But I've heard him cough a few times, and I reckon he'd be better with an injection." The temperature was slightly elevated, and I filled a syringe with the penicillin suspension, which the veterinary profession had recently acquired. I leant over, gave the hairy rump the usual quick thump with my hand, and plunged the needle in. On any farm, an animal of this size could have been something of a problem to inject, perhaps involving a chase round the box. But this one did not even rise to his feet. Nobody was restraining him in any way, but he continued to chew, merely looking round with mild interest as I drove the needle deep into his muscle. "Champion. Good lad, good lad." Jack scratched the hairy poll for a few moments before we left. "There's some lambs I want you to look at," he said, and led me into a nissen hut. "I've never seen out like them." There were a number of ewes and lambs in the hut, but it was not difficult to see what the farmer meant. Several of the lambs were wobbling on their hind legs as they walked, and two could take only a few faltering steps before collapsing on their sides. Jack turned to me. "What's the matter with them, Mr. Herriot?" "They've got swayback," I replied. "Swayback? What's that?" "Well, it's a copper deficiency. Causes degeneration of the brain, which makes them weak on their hindquarters. That's the typical form, but sometimes they become paralyzed or take fits. It's a funny disease." "That's strange," the farmer said. "Them ewes have had copper licks to go at all the time." "I'm afraid that's not enough. If you get many cases, you want to inject the ewes with copper halfway through pregnancy, to prevent it for next time." He sighed. "Oh well, now we know what it is, you'll be able to put these lambs right." "Sorry, Jack," I replied, "there's no cure. Only prevention." "Well, that's a beggar." The farmer tipped back his cap. "What's going to happen to this lot, then?" "Well, the ones that are just wobbly have a good chance of making fat lambs, but I haven't much hope for those two." I pointed to the pair lying on their sides. "They are already partially paralyzed. I honestly think the kindest thing would be—" That was when the smile left Jack's face. It always did at the merest suggestion of putting an animal down. It is a country vet's duty to advise his clients when treatment is obviously unprofitable. He must always have the farmer's commercial interest in mind. This system worked in most places, but not at Jack Scott's. Tell him to get rid of a cow which had lost a couple of quarters with mastitis, and the curtain would come down over that smiling face. He had various animals on the farm which could not possibly be making him any money, but they were his friends, and he was happy to see them pottering about. He dug his hands deep in his pockets and looked down at the prostrate lambs. "Are they suffering, Mr. Herriot?" "No, Jack, no. It doesn't seem to be a painful disease." "All right. I'll keep them too. If they can't suck, I'll feed them myself. I like to give things a chance." He didn't have to tell me. He gave everything a chance. No farmer likes to have the extra work of lamb feeding, especially when the little creatures are abnormal, but I knew it was no use arguing with Jack. It was his way. Out in the yard, he leant against the half-door of a loose box. "Any road. I'll have to remember to do them ewes with copper next time." As he spoke, an enormous head poked over the door. This was the bull box, and the great shorthorn inside clearly wished to pay his respects. He began to lick the back of Jack's neck, and as the rasping tongue repeatedly knocked his cap over his eyes, the farmer remonstrated gently. "Give over, George, you daft thing. What do you think you're doing?" But he reached back and tickled the animal's chin at the same time. The expression on George's face made him look more like a dog than a bull. Goofy-eyed and anxious to please, he licked and nuzzled faster than ever despite the farmer's protests. On many farms, a bull that size would be a potential killer, but George was just another of Jack's pets. As lambing time was left behind and the summer wore on, I was glad to see that Jack's dedication had paid off. The two semi-paralyzed lambs were surviving and doing well. They still flopped down after a few steps, but they were able to nibble the fast-growing grass, and the demyelination of their brains had mercifully not progressed. It was in October, when the trees around the Scott farm were bursting into a blaze of warm colour, that he hailed me as I drove past his gate. "Will you stop for a minute and see Rip?" His face was anxious. "Why, is he ill?" No, just lame, but I can't make it out." I didn't have to go far to find Rip. He was never far from his master. And I experienced a shock of surprise when I saw him, because his right foreleg was trailing uselessly. "What's happened to him?" I asked. "He was rounding up cows when one of them lashed out and got him on the chest. He's been getting lamer ever since. The funny thing is, I can't find a thing wrong with his leg. It's a mystery." Rip wagged vigorously as I felt my way up his leg from foot to shoulder. There was no pain in the limb, no wound or injury, but he winced as I passed my hand over his first rib. Diagnosis was not difficult. "It's radial paralysis," I said. "Radial? What's that?" "The radial nerve passes over the first rib, and the kick must have damaged rib and nerve. This has put the extensor muscles out of action so that he can't bring his leg forward." "Well, that's a rum 'un." The farmer passed a hand over the shaggy head and down the fine white markings of the cheeks. "Will he get better?" "It's usually a long job," I replied. "Nervous tissue is slow to regenerate, and it could take weeks or months. Treatment doesn't seem to make much difference." The farmer nodded. "All right, we'll just have to wait. There's one thing," and again the bright smile flooded his face. "You can still get round them cows, lame or not. It'd break his heart if he couldn't work. Loves his job, does Rip." On the way back to the car, he nudged me and opened the door of a shed. In the corner, in a nest of straw, a cat was sitting with her family of tiny kittens. He lifted two out, holding one in each of his roughened hands. "Look at them little fellies. Aren't they lovely?" He held them against his cheeks and laughed. As I started the engine, I felt I ought to say something encouraging. "Don't worry too much about Rip, Jack. These cases usually recover in time." But Rip did not recover. After several months, his leg was as useless as ever, and the muscles had wasted greatly. The nerve must have been irreparably damaged, and it was an unhappy thought that this attractive little animal was going to be three-legged for the rest of his life. Jack was undismayed, and maintained stoutly that Rip was still a good working dog. The real blow fell one Sunday morning as Siegfried and I were arranging the rounds in the office. I answered the doorbell and found Jack on the step with his dog in his arms. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Is he worse?" "No, Mr. Herriot." The farmer's voice was husky. "It's somewhat different. He's been knocked down." We examined the dog on the surgery table. "Fracture of the tibia," Siegfried said, "but there's no sign of internal damage. Do you know exactly what happened?" Jack shook his head. "No, Mr. Farner. He ran onto the village street and a car caught him. He dragged himself back into the yard." "Dragged?" Siegfried was puzzled. "Aye, the broken leg's on the same side as t'other thing." My partner blew out his cheeks. "Ah, yes. The radial paralysis. I remember you told me about it, James." He looked at me across the table, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. A fracture and a paralysis on the same side was a forbidding combination. "Right. Let's get on," Siegfried murmured. We set the leg in plaster, and I held open the door of Jack's old car as he laid Rip on the back seat. The farmer smiled out at me through the window. "I'm taking the family to church this morning, and I'll say a little prayer for Rip while I'm there." I watched until he drove round the corner of the street, and when I turned, I found Siegfried at my elbow. "I just hope that job goes right," he said thoughtfully. Jack would take it hard if it didn't. He turned and carelessly dusted his old brass plate on its new place on the wall. "He's a truly remarkable chap. He says he's going to say a prayer for his dog, and there's nobody better qualified. Remember what Coleridge said? 'He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small.'" "Yes," I said. "That's Jack, all right." The farmer brought his dog into the surgery 6 weeks later for the removal of the plaster. "Taking a cast off is a much longer job than putting it on," I said as I worked away with my little saw. Jack laughed. "Aye, I can see that. It's hard stuff to get through." I have never liked this job, and it seemed a long time before I splayed open the white roll with my fingers and eased it away from the hair of the leg. I felt at the sight of the fracture, and my spirits plummeted. Hardly any healing had taken place. There should have been a healthy callus by now, but I could feel the loose ends of the broken bones moving against each other like a hinge. We were no further forward. I could hear Siegfried pottering among the bottles in the dispensary, and I called him. He palpated the limb. Damn! One of those. And just when we didn't want it. He looked at the farmer. We'll have to try again, Jack, but I don't like it. We applied a fresh plaster, and the farmer grinned confidently. Just wanted a bit more time, I reckon. He'll be right next time. But it was not to be. Siegfried and I worked together to strip off the second cast, but the situation was practically unchanged. There was little or no healing tissue around the fracture. We didn't know what to say. Even at the present time, after the most sophisticated bone-pinning procedures, we still find these cases where the bones just will not unite. They are as frustrating now as they were that afternoon when Rip lay on the surgery table. I broke the silence. It's just the same, I'm afraid, Jack. You mean it hasn't joined up? That's right. The farmer rubbed a finger along his upper lip. Then he won't be able to take any weight on that leg. I don't see how he possibly can. Aye. Well, we'll just have to see how he goes on then. But Jack, Siegfried said gently, he can't go on. There's no way a dog can get around with two useless legs on the same side. The silence set in again, and I could see the familiar curtain coming down over the farmer's face. He knew what was in our minds, and he wasn't going to have it. In fact, I knew what he was going to say next. Is he suffering? No, he isn't, Siegfried replied. There's no pain in the fracture now, and the paralysis is painless anyway. But he won't be able to walk, don't you see? But Jack was already gathering his dog into his arms. Well, we'll give him a chance any road, he said, and walked from the room. Siegfried leant against the table and looked at me wide-eyed. Well, what do you make of that, James? Same as you, I replied gloomily. Poor old Jack. He always gives everything a chance, but he's got no hope this time. But I was wrong. Several weeks later, I was called to the Scott farm to see a sick calf, and the first thing I saw was Rip bringing the cows in for milking. He was darting to and fro around the rear of the herd, guiding them through the gate from the field, and I watched him in amazement. He still could not bear any appreciable weight on either of his right limbs, yet he was running, happily. Don't ask me how he was doing it, because I'll never know. But somehow he was supporting his body with his two strong left legs, and the paws of the stricken limbs merely brushing the turf. Maybe he had perfected some balancing feat, like a one-wheel bicycle rider, but as I say, I just don't know. The great thing was that he was still the old friendly Rip, his tail swishing when he saw me, his mouth panting with pleasure. Jack didn't say anything about "I told you so," and I wouldn't have cared, because it thrilled me to see the little animal doing the job he loved. "This calf, Mr. Herriot," Jack began. Then he pointed excitedly at a pigeon perched on the byre roof. "By God, that little fellow looks better. I've been watching him for months. He went down to skin and bone, but he's filling out now." I smiled to myself. Even the pigeons were under Jack's eye. He dragged himself back to more practical things. "I know, this calf. Never seen one like it. Going round and round as if it was daft." Depression flowed through me. I had been hoping for something straightforward this time. My recent contacts with Jack's animals could be described as abortive treatment and wrong prognosis, and I did want to pull something out of the bag. This didn't sound good. It was a bonny little calf, about a month old, dark roan, the Shorthorn farmer's favourite colour, and it was lying on its straw bed looking fairly normal, except that its head was inclined slightly to one side. Jack touched the hairy rump with his toe, and the calf rose to its feet. That was where the normality ended, because the little creature blundered away to the right as if drawn by a magnet until it walked into the wall. It picked itself up and recommenced its helpless progress, always to the right. It managed to complete 2 full circuits of the pen until it collapsed against the door. Ah, well, so that was it. I was relieved and worried at the same time because I knew what the trouble was and I was pretty sure I could cure it, but not quite sure. The temperature was 106 degrees Fahrenheit. "This is a thing called listeriosis, Jack," I said. He looked at me blankly. "Circling disease is the other name, and you can see why. It's a brain disease, and the animal can't help going round and round like that." The farmer looked glum. "Brain again, just like them lambs? God help us, there must be somewhat in the air about here. Are all my stock going to go off their heads?" He paused, bent over the calf and began to stroke it. "And there'll be naught you can do for this either, I suppose?" "I hope I can do something, Jack. This is a different thing altogether from the swayback lambs. It's an actual bug affecting the brain, and with a bit of luck I can put this calf right." I felt like crossing my fingers. I was still not vastly experienced. I had seen only a few of these cases, and in the pre-war days they had been invariably fatal. But the causal organism was sensitive to antibiotics, and the whole scene had changed. I had seen animals with listeriosis recover completely within a few days. I shook up my bottle of penicillin streptomycin suspension and injected 5 cc into the thigh. "I'll be back tomorrow," I said. "I hope to find the little thing improved by then." Next day the temperature was down, but the symptoms had not abated. I repeated the injection and said I would call again. I did call again, and again, because I was gripped by a kind of desperation. But after a week, though the temperature was normal and the appetite excellent, the calf was still circling. "How do you feel about job then, Mr. Herriot?" the farmer asked. Actually, I felt like screaming and railing against fate. Was there a hoodoo on this place? Could I do nothing right? I calmed down and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Jack, but we don't seem to be getting anywhere. The antibiotic has saved the calf's life, but there must be some brain damage. I can't see any hope of recovery now." He didn't seem to have heard me. "It's a grand un. A heifer too, and out of me best cow. She'll make a smashing milker. Just look at the shape of her, and that grand colour. We've called her Bramble." "Yes, but Jack—" He patted me on the shoulder and led me out to the yard. "Well, thank you, Mr. Herriot. I'm sure you've done all you can." Quite obviously, he didn't want to pursue the matter further. Before I left, I took a final glance over the door of the pen at that calf reeling in the straw. As I walked to the car, Rip gambled at my feet, and the almost useless legs mocked me with further evidence of my veterinary skill. What kind of an animal doctor was I, anyway? As I started the engine, I looked out through the open window and was about to speak when I saw the familiar blank look on Jack's face. He didn't want to hear any advice from me on what he should do with his calf. Clearly, he had decided to give Bramble a chance. It turned out that Jack's faith was rewarded and that my prognosis was wrong again. But I cannot blame myself, because the sequence of events in Bramble's recovery is not contained in any textbook. Over the next 2 years, the brain symptoms gradually diminished. The improvement was so slow as to be almost imperceptible. But every time I was on Jack's farm, I had a look into her pen and saw to my astonishment that the little animal was just a bit better. For many weeks she circled, then this subsided into an occasional staggering towards the right. This in turn faded over the months into an inclination of the head to one side until one day I looked in and found that this too had disappeared, and a fine, normal 2-year-old heifer was strolling around unconcernedly in the straw. Straw. I didn't mind being wrong. I was delighted. "Jack," I said, "how marvellous. I'd have bet anything that this was a hopeless case, and there she is, absolutely perfect." The farmer gave me a slow smile with a hint of mischief in it. "I am right cap with her, Mr. Herriot, and she's going to be one of the best cows in the herd before she's finished. But," he raised a finger and his smile broadened, "she's not perfect, thou knows." "Not? What do you mean?" "I mean, there's just a little something." He leant towards me conspiratorially. "Keep watching her face." I stared at the heifer, and the calm, bovine eyes looked back at me with mild interest. We inspected each other for a couple of minutes, then I turned to the farmer. "Well, I can't see a thing wrong with her." "Hang on a bit," Jack said. She doesn't Alice do it. Do what? I was mystified. There's nothing at all. My God! The farmer laughed and thumped me on the back. Did you see it? I certainly had, and it was startling. Just for an instant, Bramble's placid expression was transfigured by a faint twitch of the eyes and head to the right. There was something human about the gesture. In fact, I was reminded instantly of the film vamps of the 20s, when a girl would stand hand on hip and beckon seductively at her quarry. It was a come-hither look. Jack was still laughing. I reckon you've never seen out like that before, Mr. Herriot. No, you're right, I haven't. What an extraordinary thing. How often does she do it? Oh, every now and then. I suppose it'll go away in time like all t'other things. I expect it will, I said. But how very strange. The farmer nodded. Aye, there's somewhat right cheeky about it. I allus get the feeling she's trying to ask me something. I laughed too. Yes, that's it, exactly. You'd think she was trying to communicate, but of course it's just the last trace of the condition she had. Anyway, the main thing is she's a grand bonny heifer. She is that, Jack said. I'm glad we persevered with her. It was nice of him to say we. I've had her served, and she should be carving just right for Dalby's show. Well, that will be interesting. She's certainly a show animal. And there was no doubt that Bramble had developed into a classical dairy shorthorn, with all the delicacy and grace of that now-lost breed. The beautifully straight back, the neat tail head, and the makings of a fine udder. She was a picture. She was even more of a picture a few months later as she stood in the centre of the show ring with the August sun glinting on her rich dark coat. She had recently produced a calf, and her udder, tight and flat-based, with a small teat thrusting proudly from each corner, bulged beneath the back limbs. She would take some beating, and it was a pleasant thought that the seemingly doomed little creature of 2.5 years ago might be just about to win a championship trophy. However, Bramble was in pretty hot company. The judge, Brigadier Rowan, had narrowed the field down to 3 after much cogitation, and the 2 other contestants, a red and white and light roan, were beautiful animals. It would be a close thing. Brigadier Rowan himself was a splendid sight. He was a distinguished soldier, a gentleman farmer, and an unrivalled judge of dairy cattle in the district. His dress and general bearing were fully in keeping with his position. That tall, lean figure would have been aristocratic and impressive enough without the beautifully cut check suit, yellow waistcoat, cravat, and bowler hat. The fact that he was one of the few people I have ever seen wearing a monocle added the final touch. The brigadier strolled up and down the little row of cattle, shoulders high, hands clasped behind his back, occasionally screwing the glass tighter into his eye as he bent to inspect a particular point. Clearly he was having difficulty in deciding. His normally pink face was a bright red, not, I felt, from the sunshine, but from the long succession of brandies and sodas I had seen him consuming in the president's tent. He pursed his lips and approached Bramble, who stood patiently at the end of the row nearest to me, with her head held by Jack Scott on a halter. He leant forward and peered into the animal's face as though to examine the eyes. Something happened then. I was standing behind Bramble and could not see her face, but it is possible that she gave the little twitch which had startled me. In any case, something undoubtedly pierced the brigadier's patrician calm. His eyebrows shot up, and the monocle dropped to the end of its cord where it dangled for a few seconds before he retrieved it, gave it a thorough polish, and returned it to his eye. He again studied Bramble fixedly for quite a long time, and even after he had moved away he glanced back at her once or twice. I could read his mind. Had he really seen that? Or was it the brandy? As he came slowly back down the row, he had the look of a man who was definitely going to make up his mind this time, even though he was confronted by 3 superb animals. He finished up in front of Bramble, and as he gave her a final appraising stare, he flinched suddenly, and I had a strong conviction she had done her trick again. The brigadier kept a grip on himself this time, but though the monocle remained in position, the man was obviously shaken. It seemed, however, to remove all doubts from his mind. He immediately placed Bramble first, the red and white second, and the light roan third. I am sure he made the right choice, but I have a great deal of sympathy for the Brigadier. It must have been a terrible experience to be awash with brandy and see a cow trying to talk to him. The poor man really had no option. Chapter 28.
Disaster! Disaster! Disaster!
The voice at the other end was so shrill and panic-stricken that I almost dropped the telephone. Who is that?
It's Mrs. Derrick. Oh, such a disaster!
Yes, Mrs. Derrick. What on earth has happened?
It's my goat, Mr. Herriot. It's really terrible.
The Derricks were a young couple who had recently come to live in one of the villages near Darrowby. They were in their early 30s, and Ronald Derrick was a businessman who commuted daily to Broughton. His wife was extremely attractive and a pleasant young woman in every way, but she was slightly scatterbrained, and I had felt misgivings in the first place when she told me she had bought a goat. I gripped the receiver tightly. Has the goat had an accident?
No, it's not the goat I'm worried about. It's the tomatoes.
Tomatoes?
Yes, the wretched thing has eaten all my husband's tomatoes. I left the greenhouse door open by mistake.
A chill swept through me. Ronald Derrick loved his tomatoes dearly, and since I too found them fascinating things, I had been very interested when he had shown me his plants. Like many people coming to live in a country district, he and his wife had been seized with a passion for the country things, like growing all sorts of vegetables in the big garden behind the house, and keeping livestock. They had a few hens, ponies for their children, and, of course, the goat. But with Ronald, the tomatoes were his great joy. There was a little greenhouse in the garden, and on my last visit there he had shown me the 12 plants with justifiable pride. It was early July, and the young fruit was still green and small, but obviously thriving. "Magnificent trusses," I remembered saying. "You're going to have a wonderful crop." I could recall the smile of gratification on his face as his wife continued on the phone.
He counts them every morning, Mr. Herriot. In fact, before he left for the office today, he told me there were 293. Do please come. I'm afraid that when he gets home, he'll kill the goat and me.
There was a pause.
I think I can see him through the window. Oh, yes, my God, here he is now.
There was a thud in my ear as she crashed the receiver down, and I found I was shaking slightly. What was I supposed to do? Act as a peacemaker? Prevent a murder? Anyway, Ronald Derrick was a gentle, good-humoured man who would certainly not resort to violence. But by heck, he was going to be annoyed, and maybe the goat would be ill after that feast. I dashed out to the car. I was at the scene of the catastrophe within 10 minutes. The Derrick's home was a gracious old manor house with an open drive to one side leading to the garden. I soared down there, leapt from my car, and the whole sad spectacle lay before me. Mrs. Derrick, still very attractive despite the tears which trickled down her cheeks, was standing on a strip of lawn, twisting a sodden handkerchief in her fingers.
"Darling," she was saying, "I just went in for a moment to get the watering can. I can't think why I forgot to close the door."
Her husband did not answer, and I could see that his was a bereavement too deep for words. He was leaning against the open doorway, gazing into the greenhouse. He was quite motionless, and plainly he had not moved since his arrival, because he was like a business executive who had been frozen to the spot, dark-suited, bowler-hatted, briefcase dangling from one hand. I stepped forward and looked over his shoulder, and the sight was even more bizarre than I'd expected. The tastes and eating habits of goats are often unfathomable, but this one had, for some reason, consumed all the tomatoes and leaves, and left the slender green stalks, naked and pathetic, still neatly tied to the canes which led up to the glass roof. As a fellow tomato lover, I felt for him deeply, but there was nothing I could do. I patted him on the shoulder and murmured a few words of sympathy, but he still continued to stare at the row of stalks. I could see the goat on its tether at the other end of the garden. That was another point. How had it got free to wreak this devastation? But I wasn't going to add more tension to the situation by bringing that up. I went over and had a look at the animal. It was bright-eyed and cheerful, and clearly didn't require my services in any way. In fact, as I watched, it began to nibble at a cabbage with obvious relish. As I say, I was sad for the derricks. But I could not but look with admiration at any creature whose appetite was not satisfied by the consumption of 293 tomatoes. A large part of the veterinary life seems to be made up of these little incidents. Trivial, perhaps, but rewarding. I recall a visit I made to test the herd of Roop and Will Rowney. Roop and Will just didn't get on. They were bachelor brothers who had run a dairy farm for many years together, but they didn't seem to be able to agree about anything. Visits there could be embarrassing, as the brothers argued continually and criticised each other's every move. But on this particular day I found they had forgotten to keep the cows in for me. I stood to one side as they castigated each other.
I told you the postcard said today. No, you didn't. You said Tuesday. It was me as said today. Well, fetch the bloody card from the house and let's have another look at it. How can I? You burned it, you daft bugger.
I let the debate go on for a few minutes, then intervened tactfully. It's all right, I said. There's no harm done. The cows are just there in the field. It shouldn't take long to get them in. Roop gave his brother a final glare and turned to me.
Nay, it won't take long, Mr. Herriot. The bar door's open. I'll soon call 'em in.
He inflated his lungs and began a series of shrill cries.
Come on, Spotty Nose. Come on, Big Lugs. Come on, Mucky Tail. Come on, Fat Tit. Come on, Fuzzy Top.
Will, nettled at being upstaged, broke in with his own shout.
Come on, Longlegs. Come on, Slow Coach.
Roop froze him with a stare, then bent towards me.
You'll have to excuse me, brother, Mr. Herriot, he said in a confidential whisper. I've tried to tell him many times, but he will call the cows them daft names.
Contrasts in people always intrigue me. I was called to see a bullock with a swollen foot. The owner was one of the new breed of young farmers who had been to agricultural college and was steeped in modern science. He was a nice lad, but like many of his kind, he gave me the uncomfortable feeling that he knew about as much as I did. He showed me the animal.
Bit of infection there, he said. Bacteria must have gained entry through that abrasion. I should think he needs about 20 cc of long-acting procaine penicillin, intramuscularly.
He was right, of course, and I duly injected the dose into the animal's rump. It happened that my next call, just a mile along the road, was to a similar case, but this time the farmer was old Ted Buckle, one of the fast-disappearing old characters and a great favourite of mine.
Now then, Mr. Herriot,
he said, and led me into the fold yard. He pointed to the lame bullock standing in a corner.
There's a youth out there wants a jab in the arse.
Then there was Mr. Bog, whose tight-fistedness was a byword in a community where thrift was the norm. I had heard many tales of his parsimony, but I have a few experiences of my own which I cherish. He owned a herd of good Ayrshire cows and ran a few turkeys and chickens on the side. He certainly would not be short of money. His turkeys were frequently afflicted with blackhead, and he used to come to us for stovarsal tablets, which were the popular treatment at that time. One afternoon he approached me in the surgery.
Look, he said, I keep coming here for 50 or 100 of them little tablets, and it's a flipping nuisance. I'd rather buy a whole tinful. It'd save a lot of journeys.
Yes, Mr. Bog, you're right, I replied. It would be a much better idea. I'll get you some now. When I returned from the dispensary, I held up the tin. This contains 1,000 tablets, and as it happens, it's the only one we have in stock. It has been opened, and a few have been taken out, but it is virtually a new tin.
A few? Taken out?
I could read the alarm in his eyes at the idea of paying for the full 1,000 when he was getting less than that.
Oh, don't worry, I said. There's maybe something like a dozen tablets short, no more.
My words failed to reassure him, and as he left the surgery, he looked gloomy and preoccupied. He was back again that same evening. He rang the bell at about 8 o'clock, and I faced him on the front doorstep.
I've just come to tell you, he said. I've been counting them tablets, and there's 987.
On another occasion, I went to buy some eggs from Mr. Bog. I got a dozen from him most weeks because his farm was on the outskirts of the town. When I returned home with this particular batch, I found there were only 11 eggs in the bag, so when I saw him a week later, I mentioned the fact. "Mr. Bog," I said, "there were only 11 eggs in last week's lot."
"Aye, I know," he replied, fixing me with a steady eye. "But one of them was a double Yorkton."
I have a dear memory, too, of the time, the only time, I did a farm round in shorts. I had just got back from the family holiday in Scotland. The weather had been perfect, and after spending a fortnight in shirt and shorts, I rebelled at the idea of climbing into workaday clothes. Looking from our bedroom window at the sun blazing from a clear sky, I made a sudden decision. I pulled on the shorts. And as I walked down the long garden to get my car, the air played round my legs, and I half closed my eyes at the sensation of coolness and freedom. I was still on holiday, still striding the hills around Ullapool. The conviction that I had done the right thing was strengthened when I got out at the first farm. The day was going to be really hot, and the whole green landscape shimmered in the morning haze. Yes, this was the right garb for country practice in the summer. The place was a small holding, and old Mrs. Meynell answered my knock. At first, she did not reply to my cheerful greeting, but stared in silent fascination at my exposed knees. After a few seconds, I repeated my query. "Is your husband in, Mrs. Meynell?" "Nay, nay." She still had difficulty in dragging her eyes away from my legs. "He's over at field mending a wall." At last, she looked up at my face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Herriot, but when I peeped through the window, I thought it was a Boy Scout coming to see us." Slightly abashed, I opened the gate to the pasture and headed over the long stretch of green to where the farmer was resetting the stones on the wall. He didn't hear my approach, and I spoke to his back. "Good morning, Mr. Meynell. It's a lovely day." The old man turned, and his reaction was very like his wife's. He didn't speak, but directed a prolonged, unsmiling gaze at my knees until I began to feel uncomfortable. At last I broke the silence. "I believe you have a sick calf." He nodded slowly, still staring downwards. I cleared my throat. "Touch of scar, is it?" "Aye. Aye, that's right." There was no change in his attitude, and I felt we weren't getting anywhere. "Well," I said, "will we go and have a look at him?" Without warning, the old man dropped into the sprint starting position, one knee on the turf, fingers outsplayed. He looked up at me eagerly. "Come on, then. I'll race you back to the house." Chapter 29. Again, I stepped forward in time from the post-war years. It was 1963, and John Crooks was visiting me again. He lay back in his chair and laughed. "You know, Jim, I often think about your Russian trip, and honestly, it doesn't sound as though you had a very comfortable time. Forced 9 gales, only just avoiding being thrown into jail, nearly savaged by a killer dog, not my idea of pleasure. In fact, I feel a bit guilty about sending you out there." "Please don't feel like that, John," I said. "I loved it. Wouldn't have missed it for anything." He sat up. "I've been thinking. You deserve a bit of luxury and relaxation after that, and I've got just the thing for you." "What's that?" "Well, I'll tell you." He leant closer, his eyes eager. John's natural enthusiasm and eloquence had pushed him to the top in veterinary practice, and like most people, I fell easily under his spell. "Last spring, I had the most wonderful voyage to Istanbul with a cargo of Jersey cows. How would you like that?" "Istanbul?" Immediately my mind was full of the mysterious East. Mosques, minarets, blue skies, tranquil seas, exotic perfumes, Scheherazade. "Yes, Jim, and it was memorable. We sailed from Hull to Jersey, picked up the cattle from there, and came right round to Gibraltar. After that, it was just a beautiful Mediterranean cruise. The cows never ailed a thing, and all I did was eat lovely food, bask out on the deck, and sleep in a super cabin. The sea hardly rippled, the sun shone all the time, and I saw places I'd only dreamt about. The Greek islands, the coast of Asia, and, of course, Istanbul itself. Fascinating city, they say." "It certainly is," John said, "and really you have to see it for yourself. You can't describe it. It's magic." "Did you have some spare time to look around?" "Oh, yes. The whole trip took 17 days, and I had a full 2 days to explore. The cattle were unloaded as soon as we arrived, and after that my time was my own. The export company put me up in a 5-star hotel, too. Luxury room, gourmet food. I tell you, it was terrific. Talk about living like a sultan." "And you got paid for that?" "Yes, and so will you." "You really mean I can go?" "Yes, Jim, of course you can." John smiled. "There's another load of jerseys to go over in August, and I'll book you in." I rubbed my hands.
That's marvellous. But how about you? Don't you want another trip? Oh, it would be very nice, but I can't leave the practice too often. It would have to be you or another of my friends. It was the beginning of another little adventure. For the next few weeks, as I drove on my rounds, the green hills and bracken-clad slopes which sped past my windows were intermingled with the heady scenes of my imaginings. New places have always intrigued me, and, as I've said before, I have seafaring blood. I could smell the salty freshness of the wide ocean which had thrilled me on the voyage to Clydesdale, only this time it would be sunshine, and a calm sea, and one of the most exciting cities in the world at the end of it. As John promised, I had a telephone call at the beginning of August from Mr. Costain, the representative of the export company. "I'd like you to be here at 2 o'clock on Thursday the 8th at our offices," he said, "and then I'll take you out to Gatwick." "Gatwick?" "Yes, that's right. The plane takes off at around 8 o'clock in the evening." "Plane? I thought we were going by sea." Mr. Costain laughed for quite a long time at this. No. Whatever gave you that idea?" "John Crooks did." "Ah, well, as it happened, John did go by sea, and I suppose it was natural he would think the next trip would be the same. But you'll thoroughly enjoy the flight, and it means you get the whole thing over quickly. Less than 4 days." "I see. I didn't want to get the whole thing over quickly. I had been looking forward to that leisurely 17 days. But never mind. This will be fun too." "Right," I said. "I'll see you on the day." The night before I left, I packed the same attaché case I had taken to Russia. Antibiotics, calcium, steroids, bandages, and suture materials. I hoped I would not have to use anything in that case, particularly the humane killer lying in the corner. August the 8th, 1963. On the train to London, my enthusiasm grew steadily. It was a pity about the sea voyage, and I was sorry that it would not be worth keeping a daily diary on such a short trip. I would have to write it up later. But, on the other hand, I liked flying, and it would be interesting to see the reactions of the animals. On the Clydesdale voyage, I had learnt a lot about the behaviour of animals aboard ship, and now I had the chance to observe the reaction of cows to being whisked into the air. I felt a faint twinge of alarm when I remembered a story of how a veterinary surgeon had been in charge of some racehorses flying to America, and one of the animals had gone berserk and kicked a hole in the side of the aircraft. But I put away the disturbing image. Jersey cows would never do that. Another happy thought was that I was able to take my camera and bring back a record of my adventure. That had been forbidden on the Russian trip. Mr. Costain was pleasant and friendly. We took the train to Gatwick, and I had my first view of our aircraft standing a few hundred yards away out on the airfield. It looked very smart, its red, white, and silvery grey paint glittering in the sunshine. "Gosh, it's big," I said. Mr. Costain nodded. "Yes, it's a Globemaster, and to the best of my knowledge it is the biggest aircraft in the world at the present time." I didn't know whether he was right about this, but it was easy to believe, because as we approached the Globemaster it seemed to get larger all the time. It also became less smart, because on closer inspection the paint wasn't nearly as glossy, and there was a faint air of dilapidation about the whole mighty machine. This was epitomised by the great tyres on the undercarriage. The rubber was worn smooth and frayed in parts, and in fact, if you took a motor car out with tyres like that, you would be fined and have your licence endorsed.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.